On the morning of June 9th, 1944, at precisely 7:22, a German officer approached Sergeant Jake McNiece. Behind this officer stood 700 soldiers. The German carried a white flag and issued a demand for surrender. Jake was 25 years old at the time. His hair was cut in a mohawk style. War paint decorated his face in stripes. His military record showed 8 disciplinary infractions. The army had never promoted him beyond the rank of private. Germans surrounded his position. He had 35 men with him. Food supplies were non-existent. Water was gone. The bridge they'd fought to control had just been destroyed by their own air force. The German officer straightened his uniform. He proceeded to explain the circumstances. The American forces were completely isolated. No reinforcements would be arriving. No supplies were coming. There was no route of escape. Logic dictated that surrender was the only reasonable choice. Jake surveyed the 700 German soldiers before him. He looked at his own 35 paratroopers. Then he presented the German officer with 3 possible courses of action. The first option was to retreat. The second option was to negotiate terms. The third option was to launch an uphill assault against fortified machine gun emplacements, defended by soldiers who had been reduced to eating grass for the past 3 days and were consequently in an extremely foul mood about their situation. The German officer selected the third option. 72 hours passed. By the end of that period, 700 German soldiers were either dead or wounded. Jake's force of 35 men suffered 0 casualties. During his training period, the army attempted to discharge Jake McNiece on 8 separate occasions. He had broken a staff sergeant's nose in a dispute over butter. He had fired 2 military police officers' pistols into a street sign. He refused to salute officers. He never followed a single regulation unless he personally felt inclined to do so. And then he survived the events of D-Day when his aircraft exploded at 1,500 feet. He defended a bridge against an entire battalion with only 35 men. He parachuted into the surrounded town of Bastogne. He coordinated 247 resupply missions, while German forces attempted to eliminate him. Then he returned home to Oklahoma, where he spent 40 years selling stamps at the post office. You see, Jake McNiece never aspired to become a soldier. His goals were straightforward: kill Nazis, eat breakfast, return home. The army spent 4 years discovering that the only effective method of utilizing Jake McNiece was to cease all attempts at controlling him. Here's what you must comprehend about Jake McNiece. His opposition to authority wasn't rooted in rebelliousness. He opposed authority because authority demonstrated stupidity and resulted in the deaths of soldiers. Jake's childhood took place during the Great Depression in Oklahoma. He was one of 10 siblings. His family's survival depended on hunting, fishing, and trapping. By age 10, Jake had learned to kill animals for sustenance. At 19, he became a firefighter. When the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, his occupation exempted him from conscription. He volunteered regardless. His motivation wasn't love of country. It wasn't hatred of fascism either. Jake volunteered because paratroopers received the opportunity to jump behind enemy lines, carrying explosives, and using his exact words, deprive the enemy of nice things. The army dispatched him to Fort Benning for basic training. His commanding officer inquired whether Jake grasped the concept of military discipline. Jake responded affirmatively. Then, during his first week, he engaged in a fistfight with a staff sergeant. The sergeant had confiscated Jake's butter ration during breakfast. Jake requested its return. The sergeant instructed him to be quiet and eat his meal. Jake proceeded to break the sergeant's nose. That same day, Jake established a course record on the demolition training course. He completed it faster than any recruit in the entire history of Fort Benning. His commanding officer experienced simultaneous feelings of being impressed and furious. Jake McNiece represented both the finest soldier in his training class and the most significant pain in the posterior the army had ever encountered. Jake refused to address officers as sir unless they had earned that respect. He refused to salute the flag during morning formation. He refused to stand at attention. He refused to comply with any regulation he deemed pointless. When questioned about his inability to conduct himself like a typical soldier, Jake articulated his position with clarity. He had enlisted to kill Nazis, not to participate in what he characterized as the dog and pony show that constituted the United States military. His attitude should have resulted in immediate discharge. Instead, leadership made a brilliant decision. They isolated him. They provided Jake with his own platoon, his own barracks, his own designated space. Whenever another insubordinate soldier appeared who couldn't adhere to regulations but possessed too much combat skill to discharge, they transferred that soldier to Jake's platoon. Within 6 months' time, Jake commanded 12 additional men. Every single one of them presented discipline problems. Every single one of them qualified as an exceptional soldier. They adopted the name the Filthy 13. Each man had been assigned to Jake's platoon for identical reasons. Too valuable to discharge, too dangerous to integrate with regular troops. There was Jack Wimmer from Pennsylvania, a coal miner by trade. He'd gotten into a fight with 3 military police officers over a poker game. He broke all 3 of their noses. He was the best marksman in the entire 101st Airborne Division. There was Charles Plaudeau from New York, an Italian immigrant who spoke 4 languages fluently. He'd been caught operating a black market scheme, selling military supplies to civilians. The army retained him because he could interrogate prisoners in German, Italian, French, and English. There was Robert Cohn from Tennessee, an explosives expert who got arrested for demolishing a latrine because he thought the explosion pattern would prove interesting. It was interesting. The army transferred him to Jake's platoon the following day. There was Joe Oleskovich from Chicago, a street fighter and boxing champion who engaged in 14 documented fistfights during basic training. He won every single one of those 14 fights. The army abandoned attempts to discipline him and sent him to Jake. Every single one of these men shared the same fundamental problem. They couldn't follow foolish orders issued by mediocre officers. Every single one of them represented exactly the type of soldier Jake desired, because Jake understood something the army failed to grasp. Discipline and obedience are not synonymous concepts. Obedience means executing orders without questioning them. Discipline means accomplishing what needs to be accomplished, even when circumstances are difficult. Jake's men possessed discipline. They trained with greater intensity than anyone else. They shot more accurately. They ran faster. They could conduct ruck marches for days without voicing complaints. However, they refused to waste time on parade formations and spit-shined boots and saluting officers who had never experienced combat. Jake managed the Filthy 13 like a wolf pack operates. No unnecessary hierarchy existed, no stupid rules applied, just one guiding principle: be competent or leave. If you could shoot, ruck march, fight, and follow Jake into impossible situations, you belonged. If you couldn't meet those standards, Jake would remove you personally. The army despised it. Officers complained constantly. They claimed Jake's platoon was undermining military order and discipline. Jake's response remained consistent. When regular soldiers could outshoot, outmarch, and outfight his men, then he would consider following their rules. That response silenced most of the critics. The Filthy 13 achieved legendary status at Fort Benning. Other soldiers observed them training. They watched them demolish every physical standard the army established. They watched them violate every social rule and face no consequences. Some officers wanted them court-martialed. Others wanted to study their methods. Most simply wanted them gone. But nobody could dispute the results they achieved. When the 101st Airborne conducted qualification tests, Jake's platoon achieved higher scores than any other unit every single time. Marksmanship scores were at the top. Demolition scores were at the top. Hand-to-hand combat competitions were dominated by Jake's men. They won every tournament. The only category where they failed was uniform inspections, because none of them cared about that. Before deployment to England, Jake experienced one final incident involving military police. Jake and his men were drinking at a bar located near Fort Benning. They were off duty, they were off base, they were minding their own business. Two MPs entered the establishment and began harassing Jake's soldiers. One MP attempted to arrest one of Jake's men on charges of being drunk and disorderly. Jake stood up from his seat and inquired if there was a problem. The MP instructed Jake to sit down and be quiet. Jake broke the MP's jaw. Then he broke the second MP's jaw as well. Then he confiscated both of their Colt 1911 pistols. He walked outside the bar and discharged all 16 rounds into a street sign. Then he returned inside and waited for the MPs to regain consciousness so he could turn himself into them. The MPs placed Jake under arrest and brought him before his commanding officer. The officer examined Jake's record. 8 disciplinary write-ups, multiple assaults, constant insubordination. He should have court-martialed Jake immediately. Instead, he proposed a deal. There existed a record for ruck marching 136 miles from Fort Benning to another base. Very few soldiers had ever completed that distance. If Jake and his men would attempt this march, the officer would overlook the MP incident entirely. Jake agreed to the terms, but he added one additional condition. He would complete the 136-mile march without changing his socks or developing a single blister. The commanding officer laughed at this claim. He stated it was impossible. Jake responded simply, "Watch me." 10 days later, Jake completed all 136 miles. He wore full combat gear. He carried a 60-pound ruck. He developed no blisters. His feet were in perfect condition. The army doctors found it unbelievable. Jake's explanation was straightforward. He had been walking and working since age 10. His feet were tougher than boot leather. The commanding officer honoured his word and dropped all charges. Jake and the Filthy 13 deployed to England in early 1944. Once stationed in England, Jake's men immediately began causing difficulties. The British maintained strict food rationing policies. No hunting was permitted. No fishing was allowed. Poaching on the king's property was absolutely forbidden. Jake observed the British rations. He surveyed the countryside. He saw deer, rabbits, and pheasants everywhere. He commenced hunting with his M1 Garand rifle. He used military explosives for fishing. He trapped rabbits using techniques he'd learned in Oklahoma. Within weeks, Jake's platoon was consuming better food than the officers. They were also violating approximately 47 different British laws. A local landowner filed legal action against the United States government. The complaint alleged that American soldiers were illegally hunting his game animals. Jake's commanding officer summoned him and inquired whether Jake bore responsibility. Jake confirmed that he did. His men required proper nutrition if they were going to jump into France and engage Germans in combat. The officer asked what Jake expected him to do about the situation. The lawsuit was a serious matter. Jake looked directly at his commanding officer and posed a question. "What are you going to do? Send me on an impossible jump into German-occupied territory?" Then Jake smiled and mentioned that he was into that sort of thing. The officer recognized the problem immediately. You cannot threaten a man who volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the military with additional danger. Jake avoided punishment once again. On June 5, 1944, Jake McNiece and the Filthy 13 prepared for their jump into Normandy. Jake had applied white war stripes to his face as paint. He'd given himself a mohawk haircut. Some of his men had shaved their heads completely bald. A photographer from Stars and Stripes saw them and took photographs. Those photographs became the most famous images associated with D-Day paratroopers. The ones you've encountered in every World War II documentary. That's Jake McNiece, the individual who appeared like a psychopath and behaved like one as well. At 11:47 p.m. on June 5th, Jake's C-47 aircraft departed from England. Destination was Drop Zone A near Carentan, France. The plan was straightforward. Jump at 1,000 feet elevation. Link up with other paratroopers. Secure bridges and road intersections to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. At 1:23 a.m. on June 6th, Jake's aircraft crossed the French coastline. German anti-aircraft fire commenced immediately. 88mm flak, 37mm cannons, tracer rounds filled the night sky with fire. The C-47 vibrated violently. Jake's jumpmaster ordered everyone to stand up and connect their static lines. At 1:26 a.m., an 88mm shell struck the C-47's fuel tank directly. The explosion tore through the aircraft structure. Fuel ignited instantly. The plane's tail section separated from the fuselage. Men who hadn't yet jumped were thrown into the night sky without pulling their ripcords. Jake was positioned in the door opening when the plane exploded. The blast threw him backward. His static line deployed his parachute automatically. He fell 1,500 feet through burning debris and continuing anti-aircraft fire. His parachute opened barely in time. One panel was actively burning. 2 other panels were shredded and torn. Jake impacted the ground with significant force. He landed in a flooded agricultural field. He went underwater immediately. His gear dragged him downward. He cut his parachute harness free. He surfaced and gasped for air. Around him, the night was absolute chaos. Planes were burning in the sky. Parachutes drifted into German positions. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Jake extracted his rifle from the water. He inspected his ammunition. He began searching for his men. By dawn's arrival, Jake had located 9 members of the Filthy 13. 4 were confirmed dead. The remainder were scattered across Normandy, but 9 men constituted enough force. Jake assembled his survivors and explained the mission parameters. They were assigned to secure a bridge at Chef Dupont. The bridge crossed the Murderette River. It was critical for blocking German reinforcement routes. The problem was straightforward. Jake commanded 9 men. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans maintained at least 200 soldiers defending the area. Jake's solution was simpler still. Attack regardless. At 6:34 a.m. on June 6th, Jake and his 9 paratroopers launched their attack on German positions surrounding Chef Dupont. They employed the same tactical methods Jake had learned while poaching in Oklahoma. Move with silence, utilize available cover, strike rapidly, disappear completely. The Germans were not anticipating 9 men to assault a force of 200. Jake's squad maneuvered through hedgerows. They established ambush positions. They exploited German confusion against them. By 9 a.m., additional American paratroopers had successfully linked up with Jake's group. His 9 men expanded to 35 soldiers. By 11 a.m., they had captured the bridge at Chef Dupont. The Germans withdrew, regrouped their forces and prepared a counterattack. At 2:17 p.m., German artillery began striking the bridge location. Jake and his men excavated defensive positions. They fortified their positions. They prepared to maintain their hold. At 4:43 p.m., American P-47 fighter aircraft appeared in the sky overhead. Jake's men waved their arms. They signaled frantically. They attempted to identify themselves as friendly forces. The P-47 circled the area. Then they proceeded to bomb the bridge. American planes bombing American paratroopers. This occurred because someone at headquarters believed the bridge remained under German control. The bombs completely destroyed the bridge. Jake's men had risked 35 lives, capturing throughout the entire day. Jake observed his bridge collapse into the Murderette River. He watched the mission he'd risked 35 lives to accomplish transform into rubble and debris. Then he started laughing, because naturally the Air Force would bomb their own personnel. Of course the Army would demolish the bridge they'd ordered paratroopers to capture in the first place. Jake's men regarded him as though he'd lost his sanity. Jake explained the circumstances with clarity. They had just captured a bridge the Army no longer required. So at this moment they were stranded behind German lines, with no mission objective, no supplies, and no route home. They might as well make the Germans regret their presence. Jake repositioned his men on elevated terrain overlooking the destroyed bridge. He established machine gun positions. He prepared defensive lines. If the Germans desired the crossing point, they would need to advance through 35 paratroopers who possessed nothing remaining to lose. But Jake didn't simply dig in at random locations. He understood something about defensive warfare that most officers never comprehended. Terrain determines the outcome of battles, not numerical superiority. The high ground overlooking the demolished bridge featured 3 natural choke points. These were narrow approaches where attacking forces would compress together. Perfect killing zones. Jake positioned his .30 caliber machine guns to provide coverage of those choke points with overlapping fields of fire. Any German soldier attempting to advance would receive fire from multiple angles simultaneously. He placed his most skilled riflemen in elevated positions offering clear sight lines. He instructed them to target German officers and NCOs first. Kill the leadership structure, and the attack disintegrates. He positioned his bar gunners to suppress German support weapons. Machine gun teams, mortar crews, anything capable of providing covering fire for German infantry. And he maintained a mobile reserve force of 5 men. Their assignment was to plug any holes in the defense. If Germans achieved a breakthrough at any location, the reserve would execute an immediate counterattack. Jake explained the tactical plan to his 35 men. He told them the unvarnished truth. No reinforcements would be arriving. No supplies were coming. No escape route existed. The bridge was gone. The mission was terminated. But 700 Germans were preparing to attack. Jake's men could either surrender or make those Germans pay dearly for every inch of ground they attempted to take. His paratroopers selected the option to fight. Jake provided them with one additional instruction. Conserve ammunition carefully. Make every single shot count. The Germans possessed unlimited supplies. Jake's men possessed only whatever they'd carried from the landing zone. If they exhausted their bullets, they would lose the engagement. The matter was that simple. The men settled into their assigned positions. They inspected their weapons. They waited. On June 7th, at 8:00 a.m., German scouts approached the destroyed bridge location. They observed American paratroopers dug into positions on the high ground. They reported back to their command. On June 8th, the Germans probed Jake's defensive perimeter. Small squad-level attacks, testing American positions and responses. Jake's men eliminated them all. On June 9th at 7:22 a.m., the German officer arrived carrying his white flag of truce. 700 soldiers accompanied him, multiple machine gun positions, artillery support available. The Germans commanded overwhelming numerical force. The officer dismounted from his horse. He walked directly up to Jake. He demanded surrender. Jake was completely out of food, completely out of water. His men had been reduced to eating grass and drinking from puddles. But Jake McNiece had survived an aircraft explosion. He'd swum out of a flooded field. He'd captured a bridge. He'd watched his own air force destroy it. He'd spent 3 days enduring German gunfire. He was not in any mood to surrender. Jake informed the German officer to launch his attack if he desired, but he should understand that Jake's 35 paratroopers were dug into fortified positions on elevated ground with overlapping fields of fire, and they'd been eating grass for 3 days straight, which had rendered them extremely irritable. The German officer stated that Jake's position was hopeless. Reinforcements were not coming. Supplies were not coming. Surrender represented the logical choice available. Jake responded that logic was for people who hadn't just witnessed their own Air Force bomb them. The German officer returned to his lines. At 9:14 a.m., the German assault commenced, 700 soldiers advancing uphill, machine guns providing fire, artillery shells falling on American positions. Jake's men waited patiently. They allowed the Germans to commit to the attack. They allowed them to bunch together on the approach routes. The Germans advanced in 3 distinct waves. First wave consisted of 200 infantry soldiers. Second wave contained another 200 with machine gun support elements. Third wave held 300 soldiers in reserve. standard German assault doctrine. Overwhelmed the defensive position with superior numbers. It should have succeeded. The first German wave struck the narrow choke points, exactly as Jake had predicted. Soldiers compressed together on the approach trails. Perfect targets for concentrated fire. Jake waited until they reached 100 yards distance. Then he issued the order to fire. 35 paratroopers. Every weapon they possessed. M1 Garans, bars, machine guns, grenades. The effect was catastrophic for the attackers. The 30 caliber machine guns opened fire first, 500 rounds per minute from each weapon. Tracers streaked down the slope. German soldiers fell in groups. The riflemen followed immediately afterward. Disciplined, precisely aimed shots. Jake's men had trained for months to shoot both rapidly and accurately. Now that training yielded dividends, German soldiers collapsed, their advance stalled completely. Men dove for cover that didn't exist in the kill zones. The bar gunners suppressed German machine gun teams attempting to establish support positions. The Germans couldn't establish an effective base of fire. They couldn't provide covering fire for their advancing infantry. Without covering fire, the German infantry remained exposed, advancing uphill directly into concentrated American defensive fire. The first wave collapsed within minutes. Bodies accumulated on the slope. Wounded soldiers screamed in agony. The survivors retreated back down the hill. Jake's men had been firing for perhaps 3 minutes total. German casualties amounted to at least 40 dead or wounded. American casualties remained at 0. The Germans regrouped their forces and attempted another assault at 11:30 a.m. This time, they brought mortar support. They commenced dropping rounds on Jake's positions before the infantry advanced forward. The mortar barrage was substantial. Explosions walked systematically across the American defensive line. Shrapnel tore through trees and vegetation. But Jake had positioned his men in defilade behind the military crest of the hill. The mortar rounds were impacting on the forward slope, not the reverse slope where his men had dug their positions. The barrage appeared impressive. It sounded absolutely terrifying. It accomplished precisely nothing. When the mortar fire ceased, the German infantry advanced once more. Same result as before. Jake's machine guns cut them down systematically. His riflemen eliminated anyone who approached close. The bar gunners suppressed German support weapons effectively. The second wave lasted 5 minutes before collapsing entirely. German casualties numbered another 50 dead or wounded. American casualties remained at 0 still. At 2:30 p.m, the Germans brought up artillery pieces. They commenced shelling Jake's positions with direct fire. Jake's men hunkered down in their positions. They survived the barrage. They waited for what would come next. At 4:00 p.m, the Germans attacked again, this time accompanied by tank support. 2 Panzer 75mm main guns, machine guns mounted, thick armour plating that M1 Garand bullets couldn't penetrate. Jake's men possessed no bazookas, no anti-tank weapons, no method of destroying armour. The army had promised anti-tank weapons would be delivered following the parachute drop. That promise was never fulfilled. The tanks rumbled up the road toward Jake's position. German infantry followed closely behind, utilising the tanks for protective cover. Jake observed through his binoculars. He assessed the tactical situation. The tanks were advancing along the main road, the only approach route wide enough to accommodate armour. The road ran through a narrow defile between 2 hills. Perfect location for an ambush. But Jake couldn't ambush the tanks themselves. He could only ambush the supporting infantry. He repositioned 2 machine gun teams. He instructed them to ignore the tanks completely. Focus all available fire on German infantry forces. When the tanks reached the defile location, Jake's machine guns opened fire. Not targeting the tanks, targeting the soldiers walking behind them. German infantry scattered in panic. They dove for any available cover. They stopped their advance completely. The tanks continued moving forward, but they now lacked infantry support. They were vulnerable as a result. Not vulnerable to Jake's weapons specifically, vulnerable to terrain features, The road through the defile was extremely narrow. Steep embankments rose on both sides. The tanks had to remain on the road's surface, or risk becoming stuck in the terrain, and remaining on the road meant they couldn't maneuver effectively, couldn't execute flanking movements, couldn't obtain firing angles on Jake's positions. The tanks fired their main guns. 75mm shells screamed into the hillside terrain. Explosions tore up dirt and trees, but Jake's men were dug into positions on the reverse slope. The tank rounds were impacting the forward slope exclusively, close enough to feel the concussion, too far away to cause fatalities. The tanks couldn't elevate their gun tubes high enough to strike Jake's positions. The angle was too steep geometrically, so the tanks simply sat there in position, firing uselessly into the hillside, while Jake's men systematically killed every German soldier who attempted to provide them support. After 30 minutes elapsed, the tanks withdrew. They were out of viable targets, out of infantry support. Jake's defensive plan had functioned perfectly. The terrain negated German armour advantage. The choke points negated German numerical superiority. American casualties still remained at 0. By nightfall on June 9th, the Germans had executed 5 major assault attempts. Every single attack had failed. German casualties numbered 127, confirmed dead. Hundreds more wounded. American casualties remained at 0. On June 10th, at dawn, American reinforcements finally arrived on site, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division. They'd fought their way through German lines to reach Jake's position. The relief force commander located Jake and his 35 men still maintaining control of the high ground. He requested a status report. Jake stated they were out of food, out of water, and out of patience, but the Germans had not taken the position. The commander inquired how many casualties Jake had sustained during the engagement. Jake responded with 0. The commander didn't believe the report. He thought Jake was experiencing shock. He asked again for confirmation. Jake repeated his answer, 0 casualties. Then he inquired whether the relief force had brought any food supplies because his men were tired of eating grass. The army eventually determined what had transpired. 35 paratroopers had defended a destroyed bridge against 700 Germans for 72 continuous hours. 0 friendly casualties sustained. Over 100 German soldiers killed. Nobody knew what to do with that information. Jake McNiece should have received a Medal of Honor, should have been promoted through the ranks, should have received official recognition. Instead, he received a Bronze Star Medal and orders to report for his next mission assignment. Because the army had learned something important about Jake McNiece. He was too proficient at killing to waste on promotions and ceremonial events. By December 1944, Jake had survived 6 months of continuous combat operations in France. The Filthy 13 were reduced to 4 original members. The remainder were dead, wounded, or transferred to other units. On December 16th, Germany launched a massive counter-offensive operation through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge. German forces completely surrounded the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, Belgium. 11,000 American soldiers completely isolated. No supplies available, no reinforcements possible. The army required someone to parachute into a surrounded city and establish radio equipment to coordinate resupply drops. They requested volunteers. Jake McNiece raised his hand. On December 18th at 3:47 a.m., Jake and 9 other Pathfinders loaded into C-47 transport aircraft. Their mission assignment was to parachute into Bastogne, establish radio contact with command, coordinate resupply drop operations. The weather conditions were terrible. Heavy fog blanketed everything. 0 visibility. German anti-aircraft positions surrounded the city perimeter. The C-47 pilot stated the mission constituted suicide. No method existed to see the drop zone. No method existed to avoid flak fire. Jake responded that was acceptable. He'd survived worse circumstances. At 7:23 a.m., Jake's aircraft reached Bastogne airspace. The pilot couldn't see the ground surface, couldn't see the city, just white fog and occasional German tracer fire streaking through the clouds. The jump master instructed Jake to jump anyway. Jake jumped into fog at 1,000 feet elevation with absolutely no idea where he would land. His parachute deployed and opened. He fell through cloud layers. He impacted the ground hard. He was positioned in the middle of Bastogne, surrounded by American soldiers from the 101st who were shocked to observe anyone parachuting into the city. Jake inquired where the German positions were located. A sergeant pointed in every direction around them. He stated the Germans had the city surrounded on all sides. Jake asked where his other Pathfinders had landed. The sergeant responded that 3 had landed inside the American perimeter. The remainder landed outside the lines, probably captured or killed by Germans. Jake refused to accept that assessment. He spent the next 2 hours searching throughout the city, dodging German fire, locating scattered Pathfinders. By 9 a.m., he'd successfully found 8 of his 10 men. 2 were confirmed dead. 8 Pathfinders constituted enough personnel. Jake divided his team into 2 groups, one positioned on the east side of Bastogne, one on the west side. Each team established radio equipment. They began bouncing signals back and forth between positions to prevent Germans from triangulating their location through radio direction finding. At 10:17 a.m., Jake transmitted his first radio communication. Bastogne to Allied Command. Americans still maintaining control. Request immediate resupply drop operation. Allied Command responded within seconds. They stated they would dispatch C-47s immediately. At 11:34 a.m., the first resupply drop arrived overhead. One C-47 flying low through heavy cloud cover. German flak opened fire on the aircraft. The plane released supply bundles from altitude. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. The bundles landed inside the American defensive perimeter. The C-47 survived the anti-aircraft fire and departed the area. Jake called in another drop operation, then another, then another. For the next 24 hours, Jake's Pathfinder teams coordinated continuous resupply drop operations. The weather remained terrible. Visibility remained near zero. German flak fire remained constant. But the C-47s continued arriving. Pilots flying completely blind, navigating based entirely on Jake's radio coordinates. By December 20th at 10:17 a.m., Jake's team had successfully called in 247 successful resupply drops, 247 aircraft sorties, thousands of pounds of supplies delivered, everything the 101st required to continue fighting. When General Patton's Third Army broke through German lines on December 26th, the 101st Airborne was still engaged in combat, still maintaining control of Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge concluded because Bastogne didn't fall to German forces. Bastogne didn't fall because Jake McNiece jumped into a surrounded city and coordinated 247 resupply drops while Germans attempted to eliminate him. The army didn't award Jake a medal for Bastogne operations. Pathfinder operations remained classified information, but Jake didn't care about recognition. He'd kept 11,000 American soldiers alive. That accomplishment was sufficient. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Jake and the 101st occupied German territory. They discovered Hermann Göring's abandoned castle, expensive liquor stores, stolen racehorses. Jake and his men organized a rodeo event. They consumed Göring's liquor. They rode his horses. They threw a massive celebration party. During the party, Jake met a German woman named Amelia. He began dating her. He discovered later that her father served as the leader of the local Hitler Youth chapter. Jake thought that was absolutely hilarious. The army eventually sent Jake home to Arkansas for medical treatment. While stationed there, Jake engaged in another confrontation with military police. This time, he threatened the MP commander directly. He stated that once he became a civilian, he would return and settle matters properly. The army decided Jake McNiece represented more trouble than he was worth to retain. They discharged him. Honourable discharge. 3 years, 5 months, 26 days of military service, 4 combat parachute jumps, hundreds of confirmed enemy kills, multiple impossible missions completed successfully, never promoted beyond the rank of private. Jake returned to Oklahoma. He struggled with alcoholism for several years following his return. Then he experienced a near-fatal drunk driving accident. The alcoholism wasn't a random occurrence. Jake had killed hundreds of men during the war. He'd watched friends die. He'd survived situations that should have resulted in his death. And when he returned home, nobody understood his experience. Nobody wanted to hear about Chef de Pont or Bastogne. What it felt like to watch your aircraft explode at 1,500 feet. They wanted the war to be finished. They wanted Jake to return to being normal. But Jake wasn't normal anymore. He'd spent 4 years functioning as a weapon. The army had pointed him at Germans. He'd killed them efficiently and without hesitation. Now the army was finished with him. Jake had no understanding of how to be anything except a killer. So he drank alcohol, because drinking made the memories quieter in his mind, made the nightmares less frequent during sleep. The drunk driving accident occurred in 1951. Jake wrapped his car around a telephone pole outside Ponca City. He suffered a fractured skull, broken ribs. The doctor stated he should have died from the injuries. Jake regained consciousness in the hospital 3 days later. He looked at himself. He realized he was destroying the life he'd fought so hard to return home to. That night, Jake found God. Not through a dramatic vision, not through a moment of divine intervention. Jake simply decided that if he'd survived an aircraft explosion, multiple German assault waves, and a drunk driving accident, perhaps someone was attempting to tell him something important. He quit drinking that week, never touched alcohol again for the remainder of his life. He got married 6 months later to Mary Catherine, an Oklahoma girl. She knew Jake had served in the military. She knew he'd been a paratrooper. She didn't know the specific details. Jake never told her the stories, never told anyone. He obtained employment at the Ponca City Post Office. He began selling stamps, sorting mail, living a quiet life. He had 3 children. He raised them well. He coached Little League baseball. He attended church every Sunday. He became the kind of man who'd never broken a sergeant's nose over butter, never discharged MPs' pistols into street signs, never instructed a German officer to attack uphill into machine gun positions. His children knew their father had served during World War II. They didn't know he'd been the army's worst discipline problem and most effective killer. Jake maintained that intentionally, because he didn't want his children growing up believing war was glorious, didn't want them idolizing violence. War had been necessary. Jake had been proficient at it, but it wasn't something to celebrate or glorify. He spent the remainder of his life working at the Ponca City Post Office, selling stamps, sorting mail. Nobody at the post office knew Jake had survived an aircraft explosion on D-Day. Nobody knew he'd held off 700 Germans with 35 men. Nobody knew he'd saved Bastogne. Jake never discussed it with anyone. He lived quietly. He raised his family. He attended church. He died in 2013 at age 93. The army attempted to discharge him 8 times during training. He survived D-Day when his aircraft exploded. He captured a bridge and defended it against 700 Germans for 72 hours with 0 casualties sustained. He jumped into surrounded Bastogne and coordinated 247 resupply drops that saved 11,000 American soldiers. And then he spent 40 years selling stamps in Oklahoma, which is exactly what he wanted all along. Because Jake McNiece never wanted to become famous. He never desired medals or promotions or public recognition. He wanted to kill Nazis, eat breakfast, and go home. He accomplished all 3 objectives. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about the heroes who got forgotten by history. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these stories from archives and obscurity every single week. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here.